Great. So welcome, Rob.
Hi, Don.
Thanks.
Lovely to see you.
Yeah, great to see you as always. Thanks for agreeing to speak with me today. I wanted to talk to you in part because of a webinar I attended maybe a month and a half ago now, that was hosted by Transition Together, where you introduced two major projects that you've been working on that are going to be released, I believe, in the next few months. Your latest book, How to Fall in Love with the Future, Time Traveler's Guide to Changing the World, and an ambient electronic music album called Field Recordings for the Future. So, for those who aren't already familiar with them, can you start by explaining what these two projects are and how they came to be?
Sure. Thanks for asking, firstly. So the book follows on from the last one, from What Is to What If, I guess. There's a thread from one to the other. But in part, it came about during the first lockdown when, like a lot of people, I started doing a podcast because everything else disappeared. And we thought, let's start a podcast. And so I started a podcast called From What If to What Next, where I set myself a rule at the beginning to say that I wouldn't do a single episode that included two white male guests, which was really good for me. It was a really good discipline in terms of sort of breaking out of the sort of normal people. You think, oh, well, I invite that guy, uh, uh, and and also I was reading a lot of Afrofuturist writings and people like Adrienne Marie Brown, and it was like it was a kind of a move away, I guess, from reading. All the books that we all know written by middle-aged white guys about collapse and about how a collapse is now completely inevitable. And I always wonder if in part that's because maybe middle-aged white guys are starting to realize that, maybe it's starting to touch them. Do you know what I mean? Whereas maybe it didn't before quite so much. But actually, I found this whole really fascinating world of mostly women of color in the US actually writing incredible stuff about imagination, about taking different approaches to how we talk about time and how we imagine time and how time shapes the activism that we do. And I also saw a T-shirt a young woman had on at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington in 2020 that said, "I've been to the future, we won." And it gave me goosebumps when I saw it. And it set me off on this whole changing how I was doing what I was doing. So rather than giving talks where I'm saying, so what we need to do in the future is this, and we need to do this, and we need to do this, I got invited to go to London when Extinction Rebellion held a big event around Parliament called the Big One. And I decided to do it as if I had just come back from the future. And I was going to tell people about how incredible it was. And so I bought a cheap spaceman's helmet on eBay, and I bought a hazmat suit from the shop round the corner. And I dressed up as a time traveler, and I went down and gave this talk that was like, oh, I've just come back in my time machine from 2030. Oh, 2030 was incredible. Let me tell you about it. Oh my God, the bicycle rush hours, and oh, the biodiversity coming back to the cities, and da, 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 da. And there was one point during this when I looked around the people who were all around me, and I said something like, and when I talk about how amazing it was, this experience, it makes me really emotional just telling you about it. And I looked around, there were tears on people's faces around where I was. And it really got me thinking about, and so that was kind of the trigger for the book. I was thinking, what's going on here? Like, what happens when I do this? Why, how is this touching people differently? And it led me to like the first chapter is all about longing and the power of longing. And so part of the proposal of the book is what if as movements for change, and I think transition has been very good at this actually, but I think what if as movements for change in these times, we reframe our key role as not being just to give everybody enough information so that they'll act and trying to push in that way, But what if our key role is the nurturing of longing, is is bringing alive in people's imaginations a future so delicious, and that actually that becomes the thing that they really strive for, and recognizing that often those of us doing climate activism, climate science, are terrible at that, and we can't do it without coming together with artists and writers and street
Mm.
artists and poets and rappers and people who work in advertising and etc etc. We need like a sort of like a longing coalition, I think, of bringing those people together. So that's kind of where the idea of the book came from. And then, like with the last one, it sent me off on this journey of interviewing lots and lots of people, most of whom I'd never heard of when the book started. It was like, oh, and I'd read something and then I'd go there and then I'd go there. And so I always keep thinking, with every book that I write, particularly the last one, and very much with this one, I always keep thinking, is this going to be the book where people are going to say, do you know what? I was with him up until now, but he's absolutely lost the plot. I've no idea what he's going on about now. I hope not, but it's definitely touching more into a kind of it's a book that's trying to help people fall in love with the future. I feel like we're living in a time when the future is disappearing very, very fast. There's that quote at the end of 1984, George Orwell's 1984, so where he says, if you want to picture the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And I feel like now it's like for a lot of people, particularly younger people, but actually I think most people now, it's like imagine Elon Musk Nazi saluting forever. It's like the future is even just within the last few months, it feels like the
Mm.
future is being colonized. And we all saw how it turned out when the past was colonized, and that was not great. And we cannot allow the future to be colonized. So for me, it's a book about why talking about the future is really important, and not just sort of shrugging our shoulders and handing it over to lunatics, but actually that we need to become better. The sort of time travel a bit of the title is about this idea of temporal fluidity, that as activists we need to come much better, not just at being focused in the present and when do we want it now. It's like, actually, when do we want it? In about 280 years, 35 years ago. That actually we're able to play with time and move around that we help people step into the future to help them understand the past, that we think about the past in different ways to help us think about the future. So it's that sort of playfulness. I hope people are going to like it. I feel like some of the stories, like most of the books that I write, is very much driven by the stories of people that I spoke to. And I think a lot of the stories in there are going to be stories that people have never heard before, like
Mm.
local authorities who are building time machines, activists who are building time machines, activists who build spaceships. I mean, there's some real, like, there's some extraordinary people in there. But I think what runs through it is this idea that we need to become. There's a beautiful quote that I use that the book opens with by Sun Ra, the jazz musician, who said, the future is obvious, but the potential impossible is calling softly and knocking gently, which I
Mm.
think is so beautiful. The potential in, it's like that we need to be connecting with the future in different ways, I think. So that's the book, and it comes out on May the 16th with Chelsea Green Publishing. And finally, as of 3 days ago, it has a beautiful cover, which I'm really, really thrilled about. Amazing how hard it is to make a beautiful cover. And then the music project kind of has been running parallel in that. So in those early days of COVID and the first lockdown, I found that I was listening to lots of ambient electronic music because it's beautiful and because I can work while I'm listening to it. If there's a beat or if there's lyrics, my mind follows the beat and my mind follows the lyrics. Ambient music, I can work and I can listen to it, and it's a whole field of music that is just absolutely beautiful. And there are some artists, particularly an amazing Norwegian guy who makes music, as Biosphere is his kind of music name, who uses field recordings in really fascinating ways. And and as I was listening to it, I was thinking, yeah, but what if you made music like this, but the field recordings came from the future that we're talking about? And that was what helped to create the longing for people. You could create this kind of immersive soundscapes where people could go, that I want that. And there was one particular piece of music by a guy called Mr. Kit, we called Girl Walking on the Beach or something like that. And at the end of it, it ends with what sounds to me, as when I'm listening to it, like a whole community by the on standing on a beach watching a fireworks display. And it has this beautiful sense of wonder and awe and community. And it's just beautiful. And I thought, if I did that project, I'd love to do it with that Mr. Kit guy, but I'll bet he's kind of impossibly cool and he lives in LA or I don't know, Berlin or somewhere and doesn't answer emails. And I looked him up and he lived in Totnes. He lived in my town and he used to know my son. So we met for coffee. So I said, look, I've got this idea. And then it just got started. And as I would travel around in Europe going to visit different transition projects, I'd always take my Zoom recorder with me. And sometimes I would just arrive somewhere and think, this is good. This will work, you know. So we've done 8 tracks. That is going to be released, I think, in June this year. I think what we're gonna do. So it'll be released as digital and as vinyl as well, which is so giddily exciting. I can hardly speak when I talk about it. And we'll be doing like a sort of a like a crowdfunder thing, and the records and the books will then be like the prizes in the crowdfunder, the rewards in the crowdfunder, because then we're also developing like a touring live version of field recordings from the future
Hmm.
where we've made video pieces for each of the tracks. I went back to each of those places and filmed in each of those places, and I'm working with my son, who's a very good video editor, and we're creating this thing which is the Field Recordings from the Future time portal, which will be a structure that we will build which can fit about 200 people, lined with this fabric which takes projections really amazingly well. And we're working with a guy called Tim Dollymore, who's an incredible visual light artist, and it'll be a space where people will come in and the musicians will play the music and I'll do some narrating at different stages. And then this world of beavers and regenerative agriculture and bicycle rush hours and car-free neighborhoods will be a sort of 360-degree surrounding immersive extraordinary thing. We rather pretentiously call it the Cirque du Soleil for the radical imagination, you know, and our dream is that this will just take off and be sort of simultaneously touring in different continents at the same time. And based on is based on the poet Rilke once said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens," and that's the idea with that event, is that it's a way of getting a different future than the one that currently seems to be on offer into people's bones, into their cells, to help them fall in love with the future in a very kind of visceral way, where afterwards, when they go home, they say, when I was in the future, that's what we're aiming for.
Mm. Lovely. Yeah. Trying to go deeper than just concepts about the future, but some kind of actual experience of what that might feel like.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So to go a little deeper with some of these themes, one of the several interesting things that you said during the Transition Together webinar that I wanted to follow up with you about was the way we understand time very much shapes the kinds of civilizations and cultures that we build. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to expand on that and also talk a bit about how do you reconcile the urgency of our present moment with the need for modern culture as a whole to slow down?
Oh, gosh, good questions. Uh, so one of the things that has inspired me the most in this thinking about time is an incredible collective in Philadelphia called Black Quantum Futurism, which is two women, Rashida Phillips and Moore Mother, who is a musical artist. And Rashida Phillips has written several kind of little books, self-published books about time and race and uh, um, time travel. And I think she's one of the most extraordinary minds around at the moment. And there's a beautiful, I mentioned Sun Ra. There's a guy who wrote an article about Sun Ra where he described this sort of where Sun Ra would say, I'm not a human being, I'm an angel from outer space. And I interviewed this guy, and we traveled with my band. We traveled through space, and he used space travel as a different way of talking about Black liberation. Well, if we can't be who we need to be here, we'll go somewhere else, and we'll travel through space. And I interviewed a guy who knew Sun Ra and his band very well, and I said, "Do you think he really believed he was from Saturn?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely." And everyone in his band did too, and so do I. And a lovely quote about how he was uh, that it was basically like that it was kind of played really straight, but with a twinkle in its eye. It's like, and it's kind of the same with Black quantum futurism. There's this element of they talk about time travel, and like they recently did an internship at CERN in Switzerland, all about quantum stuff and different understandings of time. And I find them really, really inspirational. So I think the idea is that this idea of linear time that people like Newton talked about, where everything can be broken down into seconds and minutes, and every second is the same, and is a relatively recent modern idea. And before then, we had all kinds of different understandings of time. Different regions had their own. Like it was said that if you wanted to travel from the east coast of the west coast of the United States in the 1870s, you passed through 200 time zones when you did that before sort of universal time came in.
Mm.
And one of the first things that any colonizing power does is to put up clocks that with bells that ring on the hour. And you start to lock that culture into this idea that everything is kind of moves in a regimented kind of a way. And but other cultures historically had very different understandings of time. The Aboriginal Australian idea of time was very, very different. That actually they really talked about deep time in a way that was incredible. There was in some traditional African tribes they had an understanding of time where time kind of ran backwards, in that actually there were tribes that had no words for the future that was more than 6 months ahead from where we are now, and that they talked about Zamani time and Sassi time. And Zamani time is like the eternal, that when you die, you remain in Sassi time until there's nobody alive who can remember what your voice sounded like. And then you pass into the Zamani time, which is the eternal. And so all the sort of creation myths are all about that. There's no like end of the world myths. Everything is about returning to the eternal. So although you're kind of moving forward, you're kind of always sort of ultimately aiming up by going backwards. And so, I think what they talk about in Black quantum futurism is this idea that certainly for people of color, time is often something, time poverty, time stress, that when that time poverty is a very real thing for people. And and I guess, for me, it's like this idea that what does our activism look like if we take a more playful approach to time? And one of the things that I learned when I was researching the book was that until H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine in 1896 or whenever it was, before that, no one had ever the idea that you could intentionally move backwards and forwards through time had never occurred to people.
Mm.
Shakespeare, Jules Verne, all those people, incredible imaginations, the idea had never occurred to them. As soon as Jules Verne wrote The Time Machine, everybody was like, "Oh yeah, it's a time machine." That idea just got into everybody. Then built time machines. Homer Simpson's toaster turned into a time machine. Bill and Ted turned a phone box into a time machine. There was that awful film where they turned a hot tub into a time machine. It's like actually this idea that James Gleick, who I write about, he said that the time machine then it's like pixie dust. It's like the pixie dust that you sprinkle, and everyone goes, "Oh yeah, okay." So when I do my talks and I get out my special time machine box and I show people my time machine box and I say, "This is a time machine," everyone just goes, "Oh yeah, Rob's got a time machine." It's like, yeah, I don't need to explain anything else. I don't need to explain how it works. Everyone just goes, "Oh right, Rob's got a time machine. Great, where are we going?" So there's something really liberating then about that idea that we can help people to become more fluid in how we think about time. But rather than time being a rigid thing that keeps us where we are, ticking along, we can actually become more playful in terms of our relationship to it. And I've already forgotten the second part of what your question was because you sent me off talking about all my favorite things.
I think you partially addressed it, but it was the idea of how do you reconcile the urgency of the present
Oh
moment,
yeah.
the need to slow down.
I I don't know. That's always such a tricky one. You know, there's amazing people like the NAP
It-
Ministry in the US who are doing amazing work, and people like Jenny Odell who wrote that book How to Do Nothing. An amazing podcast I listened to called Go Slowly, Hurry Slowly. It was all about how we can be more productive if we do things more slowly. And I tend to kind of lean in that direction because a lot of the kind of urgency that I see, particularly in the climate movement, often doesn't produce that much apart from some just exhausted, very burnt out people, and kind of less and less people doing those things. But this is a really, really urgent situation. I guess I where I kind of put my hope or trust is in the idea that if something becomes if something becomes the focus of collective dreaming, then then the momentum builds. Then we figure out a way of doing it. You know, there's a bit in the book where I talk about the process that resulted in human beings ending up going to the moon.
Mhm.
So Jules Verne wrote a book in 1865 called A Trip to the Moon. It was a really exciting sort of early sci-fi book about these three guys on this rocket and they went to the moon, and he pulled together all the best science that he could find at that time about, well, how would you get a rocket out of the Earth's orbit, what would it do when it got into space, what would they eat, what would they be in, you know. And it was a really exciting story. So he published this book, and people were like, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" And then a whole bunch of scientists read it, and they were like, "Right, how are we actually going to do this?" And they started then researching. You had this whole genre of kind of popular science of people figuring out how you might get there. At the same time, you also then had filmmakers starting to make film. The first French motion picture was called A Trip to the Moon, 1902, Georges Méliès, about people building a rocket going to the moon. And then you had this backwards and forwards. Popeye went to the moon. Mickey Mouse went to the moon. There were jazz dances about walking on the surface of the moon. There was a whole genre of awful films in the 1950s, one of which was called Catwomen of the Moon, which is all about all male crews of astronauts going to the moon in rockets to find an entirely female population who hadn't seen a man for a very long time. Very weird male fantasy. And you know, and Tintin went to the moon. You know, it meant that by the time we actually went to the moon, we'd been there thousands and thousands of times in songs and stories and dances. The longing had built in the culture to the extent that when Kennedy decided, right, we're going to do this, actually it only took 8 years or something, 7 years, no, 6 years from him making that announcement to actually setting foot on the moon. So we don't have that kind of time now. But I think it's a similar process. You know, if we can do that work of building the cultural excitement and longing for that,
Mhm.
the energy comes in to make that happen, you know.
Mhm. Yeah,
Uh,
it's not
it's not
necessarily a
no,
linear response to that. Like the longing is built up and then suddenly it just poof.
suddenly just poof. And some people will go fast and some people will go slow. But actually, the combination is that then that becomes our new North Star. You know, there's a beautiful story in the book about uh, an organization that's called New Constellations that ran this amazing event, a few of them across the country here in the UK, that was like a community dreaming process. There was about a week-long process working with people from a community about creating a new North Star for that place. And there's some really interesting sort of tastes in there about what that might look like, and then how that then unlocked the kind of organizational infrastructure then comes in place to support that and to make that happen. If we don't have a story and a vision and a dream, we can go fast, we can go slow. It's not going to make much difference, really. But if we have something that we people really, really want to run towards, which is why we need all the artists and the writers and all those different people part of this too. Then we're in a different space, I think.
Hmm. All right. Yeah, kind of the next set of questions I had was about 2030. I know that when you take people for a trip in your time machine, you often take people to 2030, which seems like kind of radical. Most of the people that I know that are doing visionary activism are, imagine 2050 or maybe even later than that. But I've heard you kind of insist that we need to keep 2030 alive as a reference point for significant change. Um, so I'm wondering, what kind of changes can you imagine happening in these next 5 years that would really, help to move us forward, not only to meet our climate commitments that seem to be kind of rapidly slipping through our fingers, but to, get on with the work of creating a regenerative future.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is like why it is that I
Mhm.
keep talking about 2030, right? Because and I sometimes I get asked to run workshops for different organizations, and they say, "Oh, Rob, 2030 is very soon. Couldn't we say like 2035, 2040 or something?" And I always have to explain, well, actually, at the moment, as the world, we only have one thing which gives us any route map to how we find our way from where we are now to where climate science demands we have to get to. It's not ambitious enough, but it's the best thing we have, which is the Paris Agreement signed in 2015 in Paris, as you might imagine. And that sets out the route map of like kind of cuts year by year by year. And what that says is that by 2030, we need to have cut our emissions by 48%. Now, if we haggle with that and we say, oh, couldn't we make that 2040 be a bit easier, wouldn't it? If you're going to make that 2040, then you're going to make the date we get anywhere near zero so far out that it's just completely pointless process. It's always the problem with net zero by 2050 is that there's not much urgency to that. It feels like a very long way away. And also, in my experience, if you say to people, "Okay, we're gonna travel to 2070," then collapse and apocalypse floods the zone, and
Mm.
everybody's like, "Well, we're under 10 meters of water, and everything else is on fire, and it's an absolute shit show." But actually, the thing about that 2030 is it's not the finished product. It's not utopia. It's not the perfect world. The point is it's the world where we're halfway there. That's all it is. It's the world where we're halfway there. So you can see visibly things are starting to change. And what I say to people is it's like the towns and cities are gonna kind of look like they do now. We're not going to knock it all down and rebuild it all in 5 years' time. That would be crazy. But actually, what you start to see is the changes happening that are visible and that are beneficial, and that people's lives are starting to improve it. So people can see the mental health of young people is much, much, much better. The bird song is louder. The air is cleaner. There are less cars. The cars haven't disappeared completely in 5 years, but you can see that there are less, and you can see there are a lot more bikes now than there were before, and you can see there's a lot more infrastructure for that cycling. You can see new systems being put into place and people flourishing as a result of that. You can see new buildings being built that are a statement of what people want the future to be like. And what I always say to people is, I think most importantly, what you can see is a look in people's eyes of,
Mm.
do you know what? Do you know what? I think we might just do this. This is so exciting. Wow, we're alive during this time when all this is going on. How thrilling, how wonderful this is to see that. So that's what I try and kind of bring alive for people. And the first, like the introduction of the new book tells of one of Mr. Kit and my visits to 2030 and a walk around in that world and some of the things that we saw and some of the conversations that we had with people when we were there. So for me, it's like actually by then we have cities who are building a food belt around themselves. They're building a new food system, which is rooted in the land that surrounds that city. It's seen as, yes, it's part of a strategy towards food security in a world where food security feels maybe increasingly fragile, but it's also a way of keeping money local, revitalizing the economy of that place, creating meaningful work for people, connecting the city to the land around it, bringing the biodiversity back. It's these things that are kind of win-win-win-win-win scenarios. And for me, when I'm imagining that 2030, the point of it is this isn't like some crazy sort of fantasy that Rob Hopkins just sort of came up with one day. This is a future. I like all of the, I've seen all of these things. So when I think about that future, it's basically the cycling infrastructure of Rotterdam combined with the super blocks, pedestrianized neighborhoods of Barcelona, with the car-free neighborhoods of Freiburg in Germany, the food belt that's being built around Liège, the rooftop farming of Paris, and on and on and on and on like that. Do you know what I mean? That's what I'm kind of piecing it together in my head. So for this field recordings from the future project, that's how it's kind of pieced together. We will, for example, we might put this on in Bristol and we will say we've just been to the Bristol of 2030. Oh my God, look at the amazing cycling infrastructure. What we're showing is videos that I filmed in Utrecht where 40,000 bicycles cycle into the centre of Utrecht every morning because the municipality realised that for every €1 million they spend building good cycling infrastructure, they actually save 38 million euros off the national health bill. And it's an investment rather than an expense. So partly what I'm doing is kind of playing a little trick by kind of saying, look at this fantastical thing. Actually, it's all already there if you know where to look. It's not like that future landed perfectly, fully formed out of the sky on New Year's Eve 2029. If you knew where to look in 2025, you could find it absolutely everywhere. And so part of my work is telling those stories and connecting people to those places. If you want to build a time machine, go to Utrecht in Holland and stand by the train station at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it will blow your mind. Watching 40,000 bicycles cycle past you in the morning. The last time I saw something like that was when I was 19 and I went to communist China backpacking when I'd only just opened up to people going in, and I remember the bicycles there were just extraordinary. The sort of rivers of bicycles, that actually we can go and see that it's possible. One of the chapters is called Reframing Impossible as Not Yet. All these things we get told are impossible. I'm like, no, 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 no. You don't get to tell me that that's impossible. You can tell me that it's not yet, but you don't get to tell me it's impossible because actually, but I know that it's possible because I've already seen it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, has been so compelling about your work is that you always seem to have that kind of twinkle in the eye about what's possible, that you've seen it and you are kind of helping to carry that for other people, helping others to see those possibilities that maybe they don't see in their everyday life. They certainly don't see on the news or from their politicians most of the time. Um, yeah, and you're carrying this out even, more broadly with this forthcoming book and the album and the Cirque du Soleil of the radical imagination. Um, but I wonder, like, what, for the very few people who don't get to experience any of these projects worldwide, what, how might they come to experience this same kind of hope and feeling of possibility for the future at this time when, as you said, there are very, very powerful, very loud forces colonizing our imagination of the future. How do we begin to kind of break through into the mainstream and get these visions and these solutions out there in a way that really hasn't happened yet. Uh, and do you see that happening anywhere in popular culture right now?
So Jane McGonigal wrote an amazing book called Imaginable, where there's in one part of that book she sets out a long list of extraordinary changes that happened in just 10 years. So like it took 10 years from Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus to the Civil Rights Act being passed, 10 years from the first international sanctions on South Africa to the new constitution being passed in South Africa, and an endless, like 10 years from the first gay same-sex marriage in the Netherlands to surveys showing that more than half the people in the world agree with the idea of same-sex marriage. A lot can change. And actually, in all of those stories, when those stories started, like no chance. If you'd sat next to Rosa Parks on that bus and said, Psst, I've just come back from the future, and in 10 years, it's all, and because of this, and oh, you're amazing. It's like she wouldn't have believed that was possible. So, um, so I think that there is, I mean, it's true. There's like, in terms of popular culture, there's not much. We are awash with dystopias. I just wrote an article at the end where I said, tear the dystopian books from the library shelves, cast them out of the cinemas. We've had so many bloody dystopian films and stories and everything going to shit in various ways, whether it's because of aliens or viruses or zombies or asteroids or whatever the hell it is. We don't have hardly any stories about actually how this turned around and people getting their act together and responding with care and compassion and kindness and togetherness in the face of these things. you know, in on the one hand, we can look at what's happening in the US now, right? And we can say, well, this is now how we're almost in Orwell territory. This is going to be how it is forever now. On the other hand, there are scenarios whereby all these people just fall on each other like rats in a sack, and the whole thing just and people across America within the next year or so realize how absolutely catastrophic this is. The economy absolutely tanked. Like here in the UK, we had Liz Truss, who ideologically was in a very similar sort of place. We need to just let the markets go, and you know tax cuts for the rich, and actually within 49 days of being in office, she crashed the economy to the extent that actually basically the rest of the political establishment had to intervene and throw her out because it was such an absolute catastrophe. Trump is doing that on steroids. It's not going to end well. It's going to be absolutely catastrophic. We shouldn't rule out the possibility that within a couple of years there's a massive uprising against this that comes from absolutely everywhere,
Yeah.
that actually they all fall on each other and stab each other in the back. Who knows. And so we should hold the possibility that there are other ways that this is going to play out than the way that they're saying that this is going to play out. um in terms of stories, so in the world of science fiction, there are people writing stories about this kind of thing. Adrienne Marie Brown, I think, has just written a novel. Octavia Butler wrote some really interesting books. If you read now The Parable of the Sower, that was written in the 80s, I think it's astonishingly prescient. It's about a president elected on a platform of Make America Great Again, and
Mhm.
everything falls apart. It's very, very, it's spooky
It takes
book.
place in 2025.
It takes place in 2025. Exactly. It's a very strange. Um, there's a woman called Manda Scott who does a podcast called Accidental Gods, who's just written a novel called Any Human Power, which is the first what she calls throughtopian story, which is a story about, it's not utopia, it's not a dystopia, it's the story about how it started now. How did we get through? Who were the people who started it? Who did they meet? How did it build? It's a beautiful book. Kim Stanley Robinson wrote a book called A Ministry for the Future,
Mhm.
very interesting novel setting out how might be that we find a way through. Um, but yeah, there's not much, and there needs to be a
Somewhat,
hell of.
yeah, Ministry from the Future, somewhat through utopian, but very definitely some dystopian elements there. Parable
Yeah,
of the Sower, very dystopian as well.
yeah.
Starhawk, Fifth Sacred Thing, pretty dystopian. Why are there not more throughtopian stories? I mean, it seems like this is, I mean, to me, it's fascinating. Like, how do we actually get through this, and like how does the future unfold to lead to something better, but yet they're nowhere to be found. Why does dystopia, do you think, sell a lot better than kind of more optimistic uh, stories?
Because I think maybe dystopian stories are kind of exciting, aren't they? It's like, I mean, the art is how do you write utopian stories that have drama? Like, where's the drama? Somebody has something, they lose something. How do they get that thing back? It's like, um, even like, I mean, when I try and think of a film that paints a picture of the kind of future I'm talking about, the only thing I can ever think of is Wallace and Gromit and the Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which has this future, has this world where everybody lives in very energy efficient terraced houses. They're all knitting, they all grow food, and they're all trying to grow bigger carrots than each other, and everyone's riding bicycles. It's like it's not perfect, but it's the best thing I can come up with that we have out there. I think there are people now starting to do more of that kind of thing, but it's still very early, and it puzzles me. And I think what we need to be doing is making, actually, even, people, if people, it's, I almost feel like it's not necessarily that it needs to be like massively like utopia and everything works out really well story. People can still tell really exciting stories where all sorts of things happen, but make this stuff normal in the background of that. I always feel like when I like football, uh, and whenever you watch the World Cup, and you're watching this game of football going on, and all the advertising around the side is all for Russian oil and gas companies, McDonald's, cars, all the rubbish that we can't keep doing. And I think actually what we need is dramas, and where just in the background people are building permaculture gardens and people are insulating their houses. So Netflix now I think have a policy where in new series that they make, all the cars have to be electric cars. So they're trying to sort of bring in things that just sort of normalize, but there's so much more that you can do with that. That just becomes the fabric in the background of everything that people are building rooftop gardens, and it's almost like we don't even that we can get hung up on, well, how do we tell exciting through utopias? Tell any story you like, I don't care, but have in the background behind people mulching the park and planting potatoes. I don't know, or different things going on in the background.
I'd personally love to see some reality series on, people who are doing a large permaculture project or people who are living in an intentional community together. You get plenty of conflict, I'm sure, to
You certainly do.
uh, keep people interested, but there's the overarching story about, hanging together and what the real benefits of that are, and people being able to see, yeah, it's not perfect. It's never going to be, but these are ways that people are already living.
Yeah,
And it can be incredibly rewarding and maybe, more realistic for, having some of that grit in the mix.
yeah. I mean, there's a film that was, I think it is on Netflix here, that was called The Bank of Dave, that was about a guy living in Sunderland, maybe somewhere in the north of England, and he could see the poverty in his community, and people were trying to borrow money and they couldn't, and he wanted to start a new bank. And it's about the journey of him trying to start a bank and him creating this thing that's called the Bank of Dave, that's lending money. That film was really, really popular. That was a beautiful example of a sort of feel good kind of little guy against the establishment kind of film. Films like Local Hero as well. Do you know that film that was about a guy who works for an oil and gas company, who gets sent to live in a community in Scotland to sort of check out uh, oil drilling in their mountains, and then he meets more and more local people, and he falls in love with a girl who lives in the town, and he decides this is a terrible idea. There's ways that we can do it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, Shifting gears a bit, one of the most inspiring stories that I know is the story of the transition towns movement. That there was this guy named Rob Hopkins who linked up with a few like-minded colleagues and began a experiment to see if they could get their town off of fossil fuels and build local resilience. And the thing took off. It spread all over the world, now in 1,000 communities in 50 countries around the world, doing, incredible heroic things with, starting community-owned renewable energy companies and creating local complementary currencies and uh, attempting to do community-led redevelopment. Um, I know that this movement has been hugely successful, and from what you've said in the past, it expanded far beyond your wildest dreams that you had at the beginning when you were starting it. Um, and yet, it seems that you've been kind of less and less directly involved with the transition movement recently, and more toward working on your own stuff, this imagination activism work. Uh, why is that? Is it just that this new work is so compelling? Yeah, why, when you've already created something so incredible and hopeful, have you kind of distanced yourself from it? Or it seems to me.
I don't feel like I've distanced myself from it. I mean, I love transition profoundly, and I'm hugely proud of what it has become. I guess for me, like the what we now think of as transition came from a very creative, sparky process
Mm.
where, like, say, I came with some ideas. I met some other people who had been thinking along similar lines. We had uh, I had a kind of a creative, artistic freedom in those early days that meant that I could write the transition handbook as a very be very hard to write a book like the Transition Handbook now. It was like with a small independent publisher who let me just sit next to them and design the whole thing with them, doing little drawings and scanning them and going, that bit goes there. The reason the book is square is because I said that I felt like it had to be the same size as a 7-inch single because that was the greatest art form of the 20th century. And they went, okay. You wouldn't get that with most publishers now. They'd be like, what? Your square book? But actually it was great because it always stuck out of the bookshelves in the bookshops. Um, so that kind of creative freedom was really, really was kind of what led to it, really. And in at the beginning, Transition Network was set up kind of to support me in being that creative, sparky person, writing blogs, making films, whatever it was that we were doing then. I think inevitably, after like 15 years of an organization becomes more kind of about, I kind of felt I had less of that sort of sparky uh, freedom to go off and do different things and explore different things. And and for me, it's like that's really important to me. I'm a creative
Mhm.
person. I'm an artistic person. I need to be able to think, actually, do you know what? I'm going to go to Utrecht and sit by the bike paths and record bicycles all day and then do something with those recordings. And that's not an easy thing to fit into an organization that employs 10, 15 people. Where's Rob? Oh, he's off, gone to record bicycles. Oh, right. Okay. Do you know what I mean? It's not that straightforward. And so when I wrote From What Is to What If, I got some funding to take a sabbatical for a year and a half to write that book. And so I did two, I went down from being full time to doing 2 days a week with Transition Network. And 3 days a week I wrote that book. And and it was so nourishing and satisfying because also it's a thing where like, if because at that point, I'm still the person who goes out, I'm still seen as Mr. Transition, the person who goes out into the world and talks about transition.
Hmm.
But the beautiful thing about writing a book, I'm sure you found it as well when you wrote yours, Don, was, you get that bit of time to read lots of stuff and immerse yourself in it. And then it means that you're going out with new things that you've discovered and new ideas that you've had, new ways of thinking about what you're talking about. That otherwise you get a bit bored of just hearing yourself say the same things over and over again. And actually, when you're saying things and people can hear the curiosity in you that led to that being a thing, that's kind of much more sort of infectious. So after that book came out and I started to get lots and lots of requests to do training around imagination and work based on the book, and then that led into this new one. I feel like what I'm doing is, Transition Network and the transition movement. As you say, there are thousands of transition groups, and they're doing wonderful, wonderful things. Transition Network is doing wonderful things still. There's a very wonderful, competent team of people who are running that organization. I also feel like, is it right in a movement that after 20 years, one of the key people who started it is still seen as being somehow the figurehead of that movement? It's a tricky one. I see lots of organizations where the people who started them have really overstayed their welcome and don't have a kind of a sort of an internal thing of thinking, I really need to, what does succession look like? How does it do it? I don't
Yeah.
know if that doing that necessarily the most skillful way I could do it. I'm trying to do it in such a way. What I've been trying to do is to keep one foot in the transition movement. I'll always have one foot in the transition movement. I love it. I found the I'll always be one of the founders of it. And I always see everything else that I'm doing as being of service to the transition movement. But if I have one foot outside of the transition movement and I can use that foot outside to explore just some other like routes that maybe reach a bigger audience, that maybe get into places that I couldn't get into when I was robbed from the transition movement. And then when I'm in those places, I can talk about transition and direct people towards transition. Maybe that's a more skillful way for me to contribute to transition than to still be working in Transition Network and kind of feeling a bit frustrated because I want to go to Utrecht and record bicycles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's somewhat admirable that a lot of founders create kind of a cult of personality around them and get addicted to that, I think. And it can be to the detriment of other people stepping into leadership and becoming more
Mm.
kind of widely held and diverse thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have no interest in that at all. It's like, really, should it be the case that the transition movement after 20 years is still associated with a middle class white guy? Really? It's like, I'm very happy to do whatever I can for that to support the movement. But there's a kind of I feel like there's a bit of a failure in there that actually, after all this time, we don't have a broader kind of voices that are, and there are, and actually it does feel like, since I've been much less involved with Transition Network, they're doing really interesting work now. This Voices of Transition project, sort of
Mhm.
with, bringing out, identifying voices from kind of across the movement. You know, I think I'm maybe, I'm kind of quite a big presence, maybe somehow, and actually there is something about when you step away that you have to step away to create a space in which other things can happen. And also, I think, Don, the other thing is, I'm 56 now. I was like mid 30s when all of this started.
Mm.
And I kind of feel like, well, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be doing this. I could be knocked down by a bus tomorrow morning. And actually, I feel like the things like where I'm best of service to the world is when I'm at my most alive and my most curious and my most twinkly eyed And actually, that's what got transition going in the first place. And actually, if I can use that in these new kind of ways and exploring these new things and these new conversations, but I can use that as always a kind of a service and an offering to transition, then that feels really good to me.
Yeah, just want to ask you one more question about transition and then a couple more about your imagination activism work.
Okay.
Um, I mean, we've said from the beginning of the transition movement, and I think this started with you, was that there's no one right way to do transition. That the movement always needs to be in constant evolution to be successful. Um, and I think there is that kind of natural settling that you talked about, that, it has to be a movement has to be somewhat stable for people to be able to find their way in without just feeling like everything is, chaos around them. But, what would really excite you to see as kind of a next evolution for the transition movement from where it is now to, meeting these new times almost 20 years into the movement
Mm.
now?
I mean, I kind of feel like what would most excite me would be for whatever it has to be to not come through me. I kind of feel like I'm one of a many thousandth of part of that conversation, and clearly when you are the founder of something, your words and your thoughts on what that should be somehow carry more weight somehow, and I don't think that should be the case at this point. But there are many, many, many extraordinary voices and thinkers in the transition movement. I guess for me, when I am thinking about it, I feel like, when we started transition, we talked about it as being a response to the twin challenges of peak oil and climate change. I think now, if we were starting again from now, it would be the twin challenges of climate change and fascism, actually, which is not something I predicted. It's not something I saw coming when we started then. Oh, in 20 years' time, it's like, really? But that was a shit idea. Why on earth and it show me like, why would anybody want to go back to that? It was a really bad idea. But somehow that seems to be the world that we're in. And so, we see this kind of revolting, um, what's the word? Kind of coalition, sort of alliance between climate denial, outright hostility towards climate science, and fascism right now. And so I feel like it would it would be very much about looking at where those two things meet each other, the sort of, like the intersection of those things, and but done in a way that is also about bringing alive what that future would be like. So one of the pieces of music in field recordings from the future is called "The Warm Welcome,"
Mm.
and it's based on, we did an episode of the podcast that I did 100 episodes of, from What If to What Next. We did one. I can't remember what the question was, but we had a poet on it, a woman from Edinburgh called Shasta Hanif Ali, who at the beginning of every podcast we did a thing where I invited people into my time machine, and we would travel forward to 2030 and get out and walk about, and they would describe the future to me. And she did it in a way that at the end of it, me and the other guests were just in tears. It was so beautiful the way she brought alive this future in which everybody everybody who was forced to migrate received a warm welcome where they arrived.
Mm.
Like, how can you have a piece of music that captures that? But I kind of think we have, and it's just beautiful using field recordings and her spoken word over the top.
Mm.
And that's a kind of um that's the sort of thing I feel we need, the sort of thing I feel like we need to be Yeah, so for me, transition would be like it would find that way of working with artists and creative people
Mm,
I talked about earlier. It would not just be community activists, it would be artists and poets and people who do video projection and all these people coming together with this as the kind of primary that we have to address the climate emergency, that we have to address fascism and the causes that underlie it. Because one of the ways that fascism works and has always worked historically is by painting dark, terrifying visions of the future and then saying, but we are strong and powerful and we will protect you from that future. And so the future just disappears
right.
and the people who are the creative future bringing people get thrown into gulags and so for me there's a really fascinating ground to be discovered about well what does transition look like if that becomes its focus. It means that it's working in different ways, making different alliances with different groups and organizations, finding new ways of working. I think that for me would be my kind of starter for 10 about what that would look like and where that might go.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's no coincidence, right, that these authoritarian movements are rising all over the world. That another thing about fascism is that it often does come from a kind of sense of dissatisfaction or foreboding about the
Yeah.
future that people really feel, whether they're identifying the right causes for that trepidation about the future or not. They are, I think, correctly identifying that the dominant paradigm, the global industrial economy, the hegemonic control of the West is breaking down. And
Mm.
right now, for most people, um, who don't work on this stuff all the time, they don't see any kind of real alternative vision that's credible. Here in the United States, the Democrats said basically, we'll keep going with the status quo with, some more solar panels and wind turbines and
Yeah.
electric cars. And I think people, rightly saw that's not very realistic. You're telling us a story that you think that we want to hear, but you don't have a credible plan for the future. So
No.
having that alternative, viable vision, I think, is a counterweight, and this is kind of what you were saying, I think, to that kind of fascist ideology that says, we'll tell you who to blame. We'll, we alone can fix it, and you just have to trust us.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I think I feel like that you could. It's not a huge leap to design an approach which So I watched recently. I saw on Jon Stewart's show where he was interviewing somebody who had written a book about poverty in America, and he said that actually you could lift everybody in the US above the poverty line if without increasing taxes on anybody, just by getting the rich to pay the taxes that they owe. The amount of like rich people who just don't pay their taxes or avoid their taxes, just the taxes that are actually owed without even bringing in a new price, a new tax bracket for the super wealthy in the US. So I feel like, yeah, people are realizing the current system is broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't serve them. They're realizing that it's profoundly unfair and that corporations have too much control. It's why, like, the appeal of Robert Kennedy is he's going to tackle the big corporations. Yeah, but he's actually part of a government made up of billionaires. It's like, but I think there is, people who are on the edge of the Democrat Party, like AOC. I feel that actually they hold the kind of seed to and Bernie Sanders. That they have the seeds to being able to talk more radically about fundamentally reimagining things, I think. Yeah, but like but the transition piece of that story is always okay. That's great. There's a political process. It could look like this. It could look like that. But we're just going to start where we are now,
Hmm.
building this. We're not going to wait for anyone's permission to tell us whether we can do this or not. We're just going to get on with it. And those stories that have done that, like the Cleveland, like the Evergreen Co-ops in Cleveland, like the Liège Food Belt, like the Preston model, like all of these things. None of those people waited for permission. None of those people waited to be voted in to do that. They just got on with it, and that's the bit that the transition movement can bring. And then it's like, how do we share those stories? We in Totnes, one of the very first projects we did, you mentioned, was the local currency, the Totnes pound that we had here, that ran for 11 years and stopped in 2019. And when we closed that scheme down, purely because just nobody was using cash at all anymore, whether it was the national cash currency or the local currency, people were just doing everything with their plastic cards. Um, Actually, that model doesn't exist in Totnes anymore. It doesn't exist in Brixton. It doesn't exist in Bristol anymore. But you go to France, there's 82 local currencies now across France, inspired by the Totnes pound, inspired by that model. They took our model, they tweaked it a little bit, they made it work a bit better, and now it's working in all those different places. So, even if things don't work where you are, you have no idea where that idea is going to go and who's going to be inspired by it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You've been using this quote quite a bit, used it in your foreword to my book from political theorist Wendy Brown. Only a compelling vision of a less frightening and insecure future will recruit anyone to a progressive or revolutionary alternative future or rouse apolitical citizens for the project of making that future. This
Isn't
vision
that?
is seductive and exciting, and it must be embodied in seductive and exciting leadership and movements. Um, and you also talked earlier about the importance of cultivating longing for the future.
Mm.
What do you consider to be a um, sufficiently seductive future to work for? And yeah, what does Rob Hopkins personally long for? I imagine that this longing is one of the drivers of your work uh, as
I
well.
mean, yeah, I mean, I love that seductive and seductive. What was it? Seductive and exciting leadership.
Hmm.
I love the idea that we need to become more seductive. That as movements, we need to become more seductive. It's such a beautiful way of talking about it, I think. Um, yeah, I mean, I also in the new book talk about how we need to make it more sensual. There's a woman in that I write about in the book called Wasima Labic, who was based in Berlin, who does futurism work, but with working with the Muslim community in Berlin. She calls her work Muslim Futures, and she uses this term sensual futuring. So when I run workshops now on how to fall in love with the future and time travel, I I do it in a way to make it as multi-sensory as possible. What does that future sound like? What does it smell like? We do activities with smells where we kind of get people to make cocktails of smells from the future. The idea is that this kind of needs to get into your bones, into the cells of your body, the more that we can make it kind of seductive in that way. And I think it's just a seductive leadership. It's kind of an interesting question, because I get lots of requests now to do this training in different places. And kind of what I'm trying to do is train seductive leaders. So, it's like, well, what does that look like? What does training for seductive leadership look like? I don't know. That's kind of what I'm playing around with at the moment, I guess. I mean, for me, I, like I said before, when I imagine the world that I would like to leave behind, maybe I've got like 20, 30 years more in me, on this earth. Um, I like to imagine, I've written about it lots, I guess. I would just like for my kids to be able to see that world that I talk about. And as I said, it's something that I've already seen. Every element of it I've seen. I'm not like I'm not like trying to magic up something that doesn't already exist. Some amazing, fantastical technology like carbon capture and storage, which, of course, all the pragmatic people say, oh, well, we'll just use carbon capture and storage. It doesn't exist. It's a complete fantasy. It's never worked anywhere. But actually, building a food belt around your city, now that I have seen, and I can tell you that works. And actually, there's really great data to back that up. And actually, building really great cycle networks. I went to Copenhagen recently. My Jakob, who I stayed with and was organising the workshops I was doing, he borrowed a bike for me. We cycled through Copenhagen on the bicycle networks. I mean, that's it. That's it. There. I'd like to live in a world where every city has a bike network like Copenhagen, has a renewable energy infrastructure like I don't know, some like Freiburg in Germany or something. None of this stuff is rocket science. That's the thing that's so frustrating about it. It's like I'm not some crazy eccentric who's sort of, saying, we need to go out and talk to aliens or something. It's like actually everything that we need is already there. Go and see it. Go to Utrecht. Go to wherever. Go to, I don't know, go to Portland. There's amazing things happening in parts of the US as well. Go and find those things and share those stories. But the thing is that nobody knows. Everybody knows the stories about insane billionaires trashing everything. Everybody knows the stories about Putin and Ukraine and all this. Nobody knows the story about what's happening in Liège. Nobody knows the story about the rooftop farms in Paris. Nobody knows any of those stories at all. And when I do my workshops and talks, and I get everybody and I bring my time machine, and I turn the room into a time machine, and I get everybody, and we travel together, and we do this time travel activity. At the end, I always say, doing this should be a daily activity, like running, like meditation, like yoga, whatever it is people do on a daily basis. This time traveling to the near future should be too, because the reality is that doing the opposite of this is a daily practice. Every morning we wake up, we turn on our phone says everything's mad, the leaders are bonkers, everything's shit, and it's all going to fall apart. And I'd just stay in bed if I was you, actually. And so we just reinforce that all the time, all the time, all the time. And the more that we can give people memories of the future, like experiences of the future that they can attach emotion to, they did with other people, that they feel excited and curious about, then they're creating new memories. And that's a really, really powerful thing to be doing. So I just, I think one last thing to mention as well, that I'm just starting work now with an amazing Belgian cartoonist called Thomas Liera to
Mhm.
make a comic book about me and Mr. Kit's adventures going to 2030 to collect all of these recordings that then will be used in the record. So it's like a comic book that accompanies the record. And he draws the most beautiful beavers and mushrooms. And it's just going to be wild and like this sort of crazy story of traveling to the future. And he's amazing, amazing, amazing artist. So, I feel like I said before, I'm 56. I have no idea what's going to work. None of us do. Everybody at the moment is looking at each other going, what do we do? I don't know. But what I do know is that the things that we've done up to this point in the movements for change haven't been enough, and they haven't had the impact that they should have had. We are losing this big time. In the time since we start, you mentioned before transition movement has been a huge success on many levels. It has, but in the years since we started the transition movement, 30% of the CO2 ever released by humanity was released in those years. We haven't slowed this monster down.
No.
So for me, I'm thinking, okay, well, what might work? I don't know. Maybe we'll build time machines. Maybe we'll make comic books. Maybe we'll make ambient records and open time portals all around the world. I don't know. There's lots of other things different people are trying, but that's my contribution. And as we say in transition, it might just be enough and it might just be in time.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to experiment with all these different mutations and see what ones are beneficial and might actually lead to our evolution.
Exactly.
Uh,
Amen.
one last question. So when I was touring around the US last summer promoting my book, I used, with your permission, this somewhat now famous image of you in your time traveling spacesuit with the protest sign that says, I've been to the future, we won,
Yeah.
as one of my final slides in my presentation. And one night when I was in Bellingham, Washington, a very agitated older man stood up in the audience and shouted, You haven't been to the future.
How does he know that? Very
I,
arrogant of him.
I did have to admit that technically I had not been to the future, but
Yeah,
I
but Rob had.
talked him down a little bit, and he explained that what he was trying to get across was that he thought that it was wrong to give people false hope when almost every indicator of societal and planetary health is pointing towards collapse.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm wondering what you would have said to that man if he had stood up and said that to you.
I would have said you may well be right, my friend.
Yeah.
And but a lot of those uh a, a lot of that depends on the assumption that we do nothing about it. So a lot of the worst case scenarios are hideous. Of course they are. This is not I, like this is not some naive kind of hopium sort of position of like, well, if we just dream, everything will be lovely, and all we have to do is hope. That's not where this is coming from at all. So the first chapter in the book actually is an interview with Peter Kalmus, who is one of the best for me climate scientists out there. You know, he's a climate scientist who understands the science and the urgency of it to the extent that he's prepared to superglue himself to the windows of Chase Bank in Manhattan because they continue to finance fossil fuels and to be arrested trying to block private jets from taking off from an airport. You know, he's incredible because he doesn't hide behind scientific impartiality. He wears the emotion as a father of what he sees happening very, very publicly in a way that I really, really touches me.
I
And so I
saw an
interviewed
interview with him when the fires were happening in LA, talking very powerfully about how he had decided years earlier that he needed
two
to.
years earlier, 2 years earlier to move because he knew that house would burn down in a fire.
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, fuck. Yeah, so I interviewed him and I said, you know, that as climate scientists, your job is always to tell people what happens if we don't do anything. Okay, we get into just there are no good scenarios in the what if we don't do anything. It's like from terrifying to just fucking apocalyptic. You know, that's the but I said, but what happens? But what could we do? Like if we did absolutely everything we could possibly do, and he calls that emergency mode. He says if we go into emergency mode now,
mhm.
which is where we stop burning fossil fuels. We have like a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. We have a rapid reduction in the meat industry. They're the two non-negotiables. He said if we do that, then we can stay below 2 degrees, and then we can be starting to put in place all the other things that we know will then start to draw down the carbon, like you know, the putting the kelp forests back in the sea, all the different things that we know that we need to do. It's like, and so, yes, your friend in Bellingham might say, well, that's very unlikely. But yes, it's very unlikely. But if we close the door to that as a possibility, then we can just say, well, then that's it. Okay. You know, but for me, the thing is, you know, there are a lot of people who talk about that. There's often quite a misanthropic element to that. Well, human beings are shit. The world would be better off without human beings. Human beings are terrible. I really like human beings, and I think human civilization has done some amazing things. I love Van Gogh
It,
paintings. I love Velvet Underground records. I love art and people and music and food and I don't want to just see it all go up in a massive puff of smoke. So I guess, when I said to Peter Kalmus, look, I'm writing a book about how to fall in love with the future, and I want to, do you think, as someone who really understands this stuff, that that's just naive hopium and ridiculous? Or do you feel that actually helping people to fall in love with the future that you're talking about here, going from saying it's emergency mode, reframing that as the most exhilarating future human beings can possibly hope for, in which all the things that we all actually really long for, when you really get down to it, could flourish in that world. And he said, I think it's fucking awesome. That's what his words. It's like, it's fucking awesome. So that's kind of what I come back to, is like, yes, of course. And when I do my time machine work, I always say there are many threads, quantum threads, that stretch out from the present into the future. And many of them are horrible. Believe me, we've traveled there in our time machine. We've seen them. They're grim. We don't want to go there. But there are some on the outer edges of possibility, but they're there. And we still could do that. And if we shut down that conversation and say, "Oh, that's never going to happen," then it's never going to happen. But if we can keep that thread of possibility and create the longing and the desire for that, then I would much rather be called naive by the man in Bellingham, uh, and actually keep that opportunity open, and orient people's desire in that direction, than to just, because also all those people who all those oil and gas people and arms people and finance people who put Trump into power, I refuse to give those people my despair and my despondency. They can buy many, many things with that money, but they fucking are not having that. I tell you that for nothing. And we need to hold on to. All great social change movements came because people were able to hold on to a different idea of what the future could be. And I'll just finish with one very tiny little story, actually, which illustrates that. I was in France 2 years ago in a place called Pontivy, and I gave a talk. And at the end of that talk, the first question, a man in the audience, he said, "Last time I was in this room, I was here for a talk with a woman who was the last surviving member of the French resistance. She was 95. She'd been a teenager in the French resistance. And somebody asked her the question, was there anything that all the people you knew in the French resistance had in common?" And she thought about it for a while. And then she said, yeah, they were all optimists. And I feel like we need optimists now more than we have for a very, very long time. And so I kind of see this field recordings from a future time portal we're building as a kind of optimist generating machine. And the work that I'm trying to do is to not like naive hopium optimists, but informed optimists, optimists that when people say, "Yeah, but that's impossible," when the man in Bellingham says, "But that's impossible," they can go, "It's not impossible. They're doing it in this place. They're doing it in this place. We could do it here." And actually, the benefits of doing it are far, far outweigh the benefits of not doing it. You know, yeah, we need optimists more than we ever have.
They say that, many revolutions appeared impossible until they happened, but they didn't appear impossible for everybody.
No,
There, there were always the optimists who believed in it, uh,
exactly,
and without them, would never have happened.
exactly.
Yeah. So lovely talking with you, Rob.
A pleasure, a delight.
Really appreciate you taking the time. And can you just remind everyone as we close here, when How to Fall in Love with the Future, field recordings for the future coming out, and how they can stay informed and updated about what you're up to?
So field record. So How to Fall in Love with the Future will be published by Chelsea Green Publishing, who are based in the US, but also have a UK imprint. And I think at the moment the publication date is the 16th of May. But if you follow me on different things, I'm on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, as Rob in Transition. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, all those things. And basically, I'll be posting about that. I think next week there will be like a pre-order link where people can pre-order copies of the book. And And then there'll be various things going on around the time that it comes out, and field recordings from the future. We're going to do like a crowdfunder to raise money towards the expenses of developing the live show, and I think that will be launching in April sometime. So yeah, watch this space. It'll be on the different channels of things that I do. And the artwork, I have to say, as somebody, as you can see behind me, who for whom vinyl records are a very important part of things, to be creating to be working with an amazing designer designing the artwork for a record is one of the most exciting things ever. So that will be coming out, and it's going to be very, very beautiful. And then the comic book, I think at the moment is slated to come out in next summer. Yeah, we're just starting on that now.
All right. Well, it's all very exciting, and just thank you for all that you do.
Likewise, Don. Thank you so much.